Hey, all.
Hey, Chris, how's it going?
Good. I don't see myself. I don't know if you see me.
No, it doesn't
Button at
look
the
like the
bottom
video's
left for turn on video. Should be in red.
Ah, yes, there it is. Hey,
Hey, how's it going?
good. How are you?
Not too bad. So for everybody who's on, Chris Sells is the product manager for the Flutter team, correct?
Oh, no, I am but one of a team. It takes a
Ah.
village to make a Flutter.
Well, that's great. Well, he's joining us for Q&A. So this is wide open, not specific to the last couple of talks that we've had. But if anybody wants to ask any questions, I know I personally have some questions. But basically, we're just gonna read through any questions that you ask either in the chat or on the questions tab, and we'll see if Chris can give us some answers.
Yeah, let's call it Stump the PM.
Chris, do you prefer hardball questions or softball questions?
Whatever you got.
That's fair.
So I can.
Yeah, go ahead. No, go ahead.
I was going to say I can open up with one. This one is actually kind of an abridged version from our first talk this afternoon. What is a good use case for Flutter for Web?
Oh, that's an excellent question. So I've noticed just the web in general evolving in kind of two directions over time. We try to do two very different things with the web. We like to have flowy content where you've got text and images and videos, and you can resize the window and it all flows, and you get responsive apps and it all flows on your mobile and etc. Right? So that's kind of the document, web pages document, and of course that's what the web was originally built and designed for, right? However, over time, the web has grown in capability, and people started using it to build what is traditionally an app, right? This idea of however much screen real estate you give it, that's kind of the space of the app. Just like if it was a mobile app expanding to fill the space, or a desktop app expanding to fill the space. And over time, these became, higher and higher quality and more general purpose. And the benefit there is that it's in kind of an instant distribution mechanism, right? You go to a web URL and bang, you're running an app. There's no install step. And if there's updates, the next time you go to that app, boom, you get the updates, right? So, we've had a couple of names for this kind of app style. We've called them progressive web apps. We've called them single page applications. But the hallmark is really, it's not, this document that you're reading, but this, content or this, app that you're interacting with. And so it's rich and interactive, and honestly, it could as easily be a desktop app or a mobile app as it is a web app. But it's an app, and it's this latter thing, this more advanced, richer, more interactive thing, where Flutter Web shines, because you can you can take your mobile apps and make it work on the bigger screen and use Flutter Web, or take your mobile apps and keep them on the smaller screen and use Flutter Web. You can build a single source code base that is responsive and adapts to the space and the input mechanisms, and distribute it on the web. The thing that I like most about and of course with Flutter Web, you get that core benefit of the web. You serve to a Flutter Web app, there's no install step, you get the most recent version, right? It's just there, which is pretty great. So that's the kind of thing that Flutter Web is for. It's essentially, and all of our platforms, what we're really trying to achieve with mobile support and desktop support and web support is that you can say, I'm going to build a Flutter app, and these are the kind of interactions that I want to have, and these are the kind of screen sizes I want to support, and these are the kind of input modes I want to support. And then you can decide, oh, and by the way, I want to ship it on Android, or I want to ship it on Windows, or I want to ship it on the web. You can make those decisions later, and you can grow and change those decisions over time as well. Because once you have your source code in Flutter, you can really take it anywhere.
Yeah, I can springboard off that actually. I think, Chris, that's like an awesome summary for sure. The project that I'm working on now is actually the first full Flutter web project that I've been contracted to work on. And that app is, you can describe it as a kind of like a console dashboard for people who are like handling leads and live chats and those sorts of things. And it's a perfect use case for Flutter Web because it really is at its core an app. It's not like a document style website. And what's so funny about it is we're at the point where we've got it running on Flutter Web because that's our build target. But we actually do a lot of the development on Mac OS because we have access to hot reload, and they're almost identical, right? I mean, they are identical visually. There are some differences on the platform channel side, but beyond that, it's like we're developing in Mac OS because it's so fast to develop, and then our actual deploy target is web, and we're basically shipping a desktop web in the browser around, I think it's like 2.5 megabytes of JavaScript, like all in. I think maybe Canvas Kit's on top of that as well. I can't remember the exact numbers. But when you look at it that way, I mean, that's like a fraction of the amount of data you need to ship a desktop app, which would end up doing about the exact same thing. So it's pretty amazing in that type of use case.
Oh, totally. And it's funny you mentioned you're doing all your development, using Flutter Desktop and then deploying on Flutter for the web. One of the reasons we put the beta, in Flutter 2, we just moved all 3 of our desktop platforms to beta. But we put it on the stable channel behind a config flag to enable that whole idea of, the Flutter simulator, right? That the desktop is really a great way to build and test your app with all those features you mentioned, Luke. And then, of course, you also test it if you're going to deploy to mobile, and you test it if you're going to deploy to web, and blah blah blah. But a lot of developers are using that desktop platform as a way to do development as well as a shipping target.
And one thing that I found that's really nice about using desktop for development is that it kind of enforces some Flutter best practices. So to give you an example, we had a situation where people were putting assets right in the public web folder. And so by switching to using the desktop for development, it enforced, for example, putting assets in the right place. And then that actually unblocked a lot of it actually unblocked and juiced a lot of our movement on mobile because we were being forced to get all our ducks in the row to be able to ship to multiple platforms. So that was kind of an added benefit of being on desktop is if it works on desktop, there's a really high likelihood it's going to work on Flutter Web. But if you're only building on Flutter Web, then it leaves some avenues open for people to do things that might not work on desktop or mobile.
Well, it is interesting too. I mean, the interesting thing about being able to say I'm going to write my Flutter app and target it everywhere is that we find people routinely 80, 90, 95% of the code just works. It just
sure.
And then when you test it, you find some idiosyncrasy on that platform or this platform, and you want to add some responsiveness here, or some support for the web or for a mouse there or something like that. But that is an amazing property of Flutter, is it just works. And that is the amazing thing that the Flutter Web team did, right? Because a desktop essentially gets to use the same renderer that we've been building mobile for 4 or 5 years, right?
Right.
Whereas web, that's a brand new renderer based
Sure.
on Canvas Kit. So that to me is the fact that I have many times done what you do, Luke. I develop my thing on desktop, and then I test and deploy it on the web. And it is amazing to me that the performance on Canvas Kit is just like native performance, just like my desktop app. It stuns me how well it works and what an amazing job the Flutter Web team did.
Yeah, I'm personally all in on Canvas Kit myself. I think it's an incredible renderer for web.
On a similar vein, if you're developing for desktop and for web, do we have any general directions or guides or areas to point to if we're specifically optimizing for keyboard shortcuts?
Yeah, that's a good question. As we add, richer support for keyboard and other mouse and other kinds of things, we're busy optimizing several things about Flutter, and among those are our docs and samples. We have recently added a bunch of sample code to show you how to do things like focus management and handling keyboard shortcuts and things like that. But if you're not seeing what you need, that's just a bug. And feel free to file that, in our repo. And we have folks that are always looking to include me included, making sure that our docs are up to date and cover the use cases we need. And that's just a function of where we are, right? I mean, first class keyboard and mouse support is pretty new for us relative to the other kinds of things that we've had in Flutter for a while now.
Yeah, absolutely. There was and thank you. There was a question earlier that was asked. I think it was specifically talking about Flutter for web, but since it compiles to JavaScript and can be deployed anywhere, is there any preference about where to deploy it? Cloud Run, Docker container, etc.
Absolutely, you should put it into Firebase hosting. That is the number one. Actually, it's funny. I mean, I said Firebase hosting, but there's probably 6 other technologies at Google that allows you to host your Flutter-based website as well, let alone all the other places. Honestly, whatever works for you works great. I personally put my stuff up on Firebase hosting. It's free, works great. It's like every time I make a change to my app, it's one command line and boom, it's out in the world. Yeah, it makes my life easy. But of course, in this day and age, there's an infinite number of places to host static content for a website. So
yeah,
honestly,
that's the nice thing.
I was using GitHub Docs, and then they started charging me $5 a month to do that, and then I moved to Firebase hosting. And that was it. That was too much. $5, I couldn't deal with it. But obviously, different apps have different scalability and reach needs than my little samples, right?
Also, just to springboard off that, we in that Flutter web project I've been alluding to, we have just started using Firebase hosting preview channels along with GitHub Actions to do our pipelines on the front end side, and it's like smoking fast. We can deploy previews for like 3 or 4 different environments in like 3 to 4 minutes. It's just incredible.
It is amazing, isn't it? Right?
Oh yeah.
I mean, the cool thing about one of the many cool things about Flutter Web, it turns out there's a lot of technology in there, is that it uses the same Dart to JS compiler that the ads team at Google has been using in Angular Dart forever, for years and years. And Angular Dart's been around for a decade, and we have been optimizing that compiler for a long, long time. And so and optimization is not just in speed, but of course in quality of generated code. So we get to benefit from all of those optimizations that frankly started before Flutter even existed. So we get to stand on the shoulders of giants there. That's pretty cool.
That's great. Yeah, that's wonderful.
I had a follow-up question for Flutter for Web. Does WebAssembly have a future in Flutter Web?
So that's a really good question. So you think, gosh, all the years we spent optimizing the JavaScript output, and of course, that's on top of all the years that the browser vendors have spent optimizing their JavaScript engines. And of course, we've been optimizing our code based on the optimizations they've been doing. Can we get, performance benefits, size benefits, latency benefits from moving to WebAssembly? And the answer is we're looking into it for sure. we've done a few studies to see not just what the benefits are, but what would it take to actually move to WebAssembly if we decided we wanted to. We haven't taken that step yet. Certainly, you'll hear about it in probably some Flutter event in the future if we decide that it's benefit to the Flutter community. But that's really what it boils down to, right? Does it make Flutter developers' lives better? Does it help make their end users' lives better? And that's really how we make these technology decisions. So you'll see it when it happens, if it happens.
If you don't mind me asking, have you guys talked about the future of hot reload on web? Because that was one of the things we noticed first when we started working on Flutter Web.
Yeah, so Luke, what you're referring to is that we do not, on Flutter Web today, have a feature we've come to call, well, hot reload is the short version. The full name is really stateful hot reload. And the whole point of hot reload is, you change your underlying widget tree, right, in your widget implementations, but the actual state stays the same, right, which is just provides an amazing experience, right, where you can actually, the way that works for me is, instead of banging out a bunch of code and then running it and waiting for an emulator to pop up and, test to see if it works, when I come in the morning and I'm going to write some code, I run whatever is the current version, and then I start banging on the code. By the time I turn my head, right, I get to see an update of what that code looks like, which is a magical experience. The basic problem is just the implementation of the protocol between the Chrome debugger and the Flutter debugger. It's a different protocol, different analyzer in the back end that does the work. We did a very early on. We saw that it was going to be really hard to turn on full stateful reload. So, but we did the thing that we could do, which you have now, but you might not have noticed you have, which is even though we don't do stateful hot reload, we'll keep you on the same page.
Sure.
If you've navigated 6 layers deep and you do a hot reload, we won't pop you all the way back and make you go all the way back down again, right? We keep the navigator stack. We keep you on that same page. And we find that while it certainly doesn't solve the whole problem, it is a lot better than not having that, right? It makes a big difference to people. Is full stateful hot reload on our list? Absolutely, it totally is.
Certainly, if others have other suggestions for this, but one of the things I've done, if I load it in VS Code, which is my preferred IDE, and I have Android and iPhone at the same time, if I'm using web, I'll also have that just open in terminal, just so that I can not deal with the shifts that I wouldn't see with an Android and iPhone. So that way I can keep all 3 of them open at the same time and adjust the Flutter for web when it made sense to do so.
So are you using the feature in Visual Studio Code that we enabled that allowed you to have a single Flutter app running on multiple platforms simultaneously under the same book? So you've got yourself a little mini Flutter octopus going on there.
Yes, I do. And I, whenever I will either live code or give demonstrations, it is frequently with an Android on the right and an iPhone on the left.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So that is my standard state whenever I'm developing for mobile first. And if I was working on Flutter for web as well and wanted to see how the layouts would look in a responsive environment, I would just run Flutter run in a terminal just for web, so that I would not. I just found it was easier.
Yeah, it's. I'm glad that. I mean, this is John. We built this feature for you, right?
Yeah.
Able to say, hey, I want to build it for multiple platforms. We want to see it as we make changes on both the platforms or all of the platforms we're supporting. So if there's any regressions, we can deal with them right away. That's why we built the feature. The actual craziness, I've drug up on stage at Flutter Interact, right, to have 7 devices all connected.
Yeah, I remember that.
The same source code at the same time. The entire team thought I was crazy to go and push on that. But I just couldn't help myself. I drew it on a whiteboard one day, and I just had to make it real. So
yeah, no, I mean, it's super useful, especially when you're testing specific pub.dev packages that may have different interactions for the different layouts. And this is where it's been of greatest help.
That's awesome. Good news.
Thank you. I guess while we're on that, are there any examples of Flutter that's being used for alternative platforms outside of mobile, desktop, and web? And we know the announcement from Toyota from 2 weeks ago.
Are you saying those 7 platforms aren't enough for you? You're saying
yeah.
Watches.
Well, yeah,
that's what I'm interested in.
Yeah, so I remember the Google I/O demonstration about I always mess up the term. I'm sorry, but the Nest Home Hub, like the Max,
sure.
And as well as for wearables. I guess those are the specific questions. But then, things like Raspberry Pi or other smaller devices with which these layouts can be visualized.
Yeah, so there's turns out there's a kind of a lot of ground to cover there. I'll start with Raspberry Pi because that's easy. We've actually one of the Flutter members a couple of years ago, actually, just to test that we were doing something that could go to embedded devices, made an implementation of Flutter available for the Raspberry Pi as a kind of an example. Hey, if you want to move Flutter to your embedded platform of choice, here's Raspberry Pi. Here's an example of that. And we know that has been successful because, well, Toyota, and there's been others that have been experimenting with it and moving Flutter. Ultimately, the goal for Flutter is everywhere there's pixels to move, and enough resources to get the 4 megabytes of the Flutter runtime going. Then we want Flutter there. But obviously, this is not work that only the Flutter team can do, right? We are a very capable team, but a relatively small team, considering that we have a platform that now supports 7 different platforms. And by the way, actually, it's not 7; it's 8, because you mentioned the smart display devices. All of the Google apps that run on those devices, those are all written in Flutter as well. And so, we support platforms internally for Flutter development as well. Some production, some still experimental that we haven't yet shipped. So we do a lot of that. But fundamentally, there's a limit to how many we can do and support ourselves. And for that, we rely on the community to pick up and move things forward. As one example, actually, I'll give you 2 examples of success stories in that case. One is all of the Linux desktop work. We had a placeholder embedding implementation for the Linux desktop that it served as a proof of concept and made sure that we had a good architecture. But when Canonical came in, they essentially started from scratch and they rebuilt it around GTK and made it industrial strength. And now, of course, they're using it in their own apps that they're building to support to run on Ubuntu, which blows my mind. That is amazing to me. That's where we are. So that's a success story where they built it and they maintain it, and we work with them to make sure that we're building something great. And then, of course, Toyota, they took that Linux implementation on the desktop and ran with it and made it work on the embedded automotive grade Linux. And then again, that's work that they do. We support them and we work with them as much as we can, but that's a platform that they built out and are using themselves. And that is really the only way to scale, right? That whoever cares about that platform works with the Flutter team and makes Flutter run on that platform, or even doesn't work with the Flutter team. It's an open source project. Feel free, make it work on whatever embedded devices you like. There is a long, long tail of possible devices where Flutter could run, and that's why we make Flutter available, so it can run anywhere you want it to run.
Yeah.
I feel like it would do really well on interactive kiosks. That's like one of the things I thought of when I first saw it a few years ago.
Yeah, I agree. And just since, well, I'm a healthcare provider, there's a healthcare spin. And one of the other people had also asked this question specifically for web. finding the right way to host something that is Flutter enabled on a HIPAA compliant platform. And if we don't have options yet, then that is one that several of us are very interested in discovering, because I really do think that the opportunities here for design and easing the barrier to design definitely helps. So
yeah, that's an interesting one. I mean, I don't know what it means to be. We have not ourselves sought HIPAA compliance for the framework, and I
right.
don't even know if that's an option.
Yeah.
Plus, I don't know what it means to be a HIPAA compliant platform. But essentially, any web server that can then serve up static files is a potential server for Flutter. So
Yeah.
if there are any HIPAA compliant versions of those, then we should be good to go.
Yeah, and I think that is all we need to hear. Out of curiosity, what is something that you personally wished that Flutter offered?
Gosh, what do I wish for? What would I want? If I was on the Flutter team, what would I work on? So I am one of my jobs at Flutter is um, making sure we have a great end-to-end developer experience with Flutter. And I've been doing developer tools and services of one kind or another for most of my career. I'm a big fan. Developers are my people. And so for me, the kinds of things I tend to think about are tools, right? How do we make Flutter development even better, even easier? And the question we pose to ourselves internally is, hey, what's the next hot reload? And it's funny because hot reload is a really tough act to follow, right? I mean, if you look at the set of developer technologies, that we build on today, hot reload, in my mind, changes my development experience as much as an interactive debugger changed it from using printf style debugging. I mean, there aren't a lot of technologies in that class that really change how you develop. One of the things I used the phrase kind of flippantly, but one of the things I'd really love to see is us ship something out of the box along the lines of a Flutter simulator, right? Like the iOS simulator or the Android emulator. The idea of a Flutter-based container that would host your app and allow you to change the settings. Hey, is the operating system in dark mode or light mode? What GPS coordinate is my app running in right now? And those kinds of things that you see in a simulator and an emulator today, but done in a way where it comes up instantly, right? That you don't have to wait for the emulator or simulator to start up. And the interesting thing about that is that means that we had such a thing. You could just install the Flutter SDK, which takes minutes. And most people already have either Android Studio or Visual Studio Code installed, right? So we wouldn't have to go through that process. You could be writing Flutter code and running it, in this simulator without having to do anything else, within minutes, right? It wouldn't take any time at all. And I think that would be fairly transformative from an on-ramp point of view, right? So that's something I'd love to see. The other thing I'd love to see, we did an experiment at Flutter Interact, something called the Hot UI, which was kind of our thinking about a code-based WYSIWYG development time for UI. Of course, today, Flutter is all about the code, right? You got your code, and Hot Reload essentially gives you the WYSIWYG design surface, right? As you type your code, you get to see exactly what it looks like. And we haven't had a lot of people push back and say that's a bad model. However, as we expand, I mean, we have more than 500,000 monthly active user Flutter developers already, and that continues to grow. And even since we announced that number, it's gone up in a significant way. These are developers that come from platforms that have these WYSIWYG design tools, and you always want to meet your developers where they are. You always want to bring them in. You want the Flutter tent to be always bigger, right, and not smaller. And so there's a bunch of kinds of ways you could go into WYSIWYG design. You know, Adobe XD has a plugin that Adobe built where you can, you know, start in XD and do design time and get code out. Hot UI was kind of developer-based way to kind of do that same kind of thing. Uh, Supernova had a way to load up sketch files and annotate them, and out comes Flutter code. So the community has taken a stab at this a few times, and from an on-ramp point of view, or working with your professional designer team, there's all kinds of benefits to such a designer. So you asked me for one, I gave you two, and I probably come up with a much longer list if you keep letting me talk here.
No, I love it. I absolutely love it. And Figma is my favorite design tool of right now, just because it reminds me of Google Docs, since multiple people can collaborate. Though many tools do that now, but they have the components at the right where you can get your CSS styles or things along those lines.
And Codelessly is busy, hooking up into Figma and working to output Flutter code too. So there's all kinds of these kind of tools in the works. I haven't seen any of them really reach the tipping point where it's the thing most of Flutter development teams uses. But I don't think it'll be much longer yet before we have such a thing.
Yeah, so let's see, what else do we have? I had a question. Are there any examples of failures in Flutter, either internal to Google or otherwise, that you know of? And what were the lessons learned from that experience?
Nope. Every single line we've written since the day we started has been perfect. Just like every other software team I've ever been a part of, right? Gosh, that's a hard one for me to answer. Here's the thing I'll pick. Here's a kind of a funny story, where when we shipped Flutter 1.0 in December of 2018, which is also when I joined the team, we had APIs that were deprecated, right? Already out of the box 1.0, APIs that we had marked as deprecated, we said you shouldn't use it because someday we're going to take it away. Except we never told you when, and we never set any expectations, and we never said, hey, we're going to take this as of this release for this date or whatever, and we just left them in. The first time we ever took any of the APIs away was 2 weeks ago when we shipped Flutter 2. That's when we actually started deleting some of these old deprecated APIs for the first time. And that was only because somebody on the team was smart enough to say, hey, we better figure this out. We set a policy, we announced the policy, and then, living up to that policy, the next stable release, that's when we started taking out the APIs. Well, when that was going to happen, we were worried that we were just now going to announce Flutter 2 and then break a bunch of these apps by finally taking out, a bunch of these deprecated APIs. And of course, we have access to quite a bit of source code, Flutter source code, right? I mean, all the plugins and packages on pub.dev, the majority of those are all on GitHub. We have that. It's All Widgets lists a bunch of open source Flutter apps. We have access to all of those. And of course, we've got millions and millions of lines of Flutter source code for our own Google Flutter apps internally. And so we were concerned that there was going to be some, non-trivial numbers of apps that we were going to build, and lines of code in those apps. So that's where Flutterfix came from, right? And that's something we announced, again, as part of Flutter 2, where when we deprecate an API and replace it with something else, what we do now, and what we did with most of the APIs or the majority of the APIs that we actually removed in the Flutter 2 timeframe, was we have this rules file that ships with the Flutter SDK that says, here's the definition of a deprecated API, and then here's what they should use instead. And the idea then is, you're using Visual Studio Code or you're using Android Studio, like most people do. And you get the little light bulb that says, oh, hey, you're using a deprecated API, let me move that code for you. Or if you want to do it in bulk in the command line for an entire project, you go to the command line and type dark fix, and you'll get the usage, and it'll tell you how to do it for your whole project. And so kind of, that we feel like that's our kind of get out of jail free card, because what happens is over time, any API or any framework of any size with any number of users, as it gets bigger, by default, it calcifies, because the more lines of code you have written in it, the more painful it is for the team who's responsible for this technology and the users of the technology for you to make a breaking change, even if it improves the API. And so that's a bad state to get into, right? We don't want to get to a place where we have to stop improving Flutter because we're too afraid to break apps. On the other hand, we don't want people to say, oh my God, my app is busted. It's time to find a new technology, right? I don't like Flutter anymore. That's not cool. And that's what we get with Flutter Fix. Flutter Fix allows the Flutter team to continue to be agile, to continue to, when we made bad decisions in the first place and we decided, oh, we have a better way to do it, to, make those changes and put those rules into that data file so that people can just migrate their code, which means that we can break the APIs without breaking our users. And that is, the best of both worlds for the Flutter team. So have we made mistakes? You bet. Just look at all of our breaking changes, right? But the idea of Flutter Fix is that we have a path forward now to fix those in an automated way for people.
Yeah, that's excellent. And speaking firsthand, that's also the reason why I found Flutter, because I had something in Java and I was, time broke my app, and I was questioning if it was worth looking into Kotlin, and then learned of this new thing called Flutter in December 2018. So
that's how it goes, right?
It is.
When you're like, this, I don't like this anymore. This makes me unhappy. It's time to look for something new. And we don't want that. We want people to always be happy with Flutter.
Yeah, it's a wonderful path forward with the quick fix.
Cool.
One of my whole things with upstream code is I think it's really important for upstream code to make explicit promises and then keep them. I think that's probably one of the biggest things that upstream code really has to do. And when I say that, I mean whether it's Flutter or packages or whatever. And that's why in some of my packages I've started putting at the top in the header, I put a promises section, and I'll write like 4 promises, like this will be accessible, this will meet this spec, we will accept any PR that helps us keep these promises. And so it's really cool that you guys went with a deprecation policy, because in my mind, that's a form of a promise. And it really helps a lot, just with understanding what you guys are promising to downstream code. So I just think it's important, and I was really glad to hear that you guys did that.
Great. One satisfied customer. I'll take it. Thank you, Luke.
I had a question for you. It's a little controversial, but
Ooh.
within the Flutter team, would you say that VS Code or Android Studio is more popular?
It's kind of funny, actually. As you might imagine, this changes over time. For a long time, Android Studio and IntelliJ, right, which is fundamentally the same thing, was the only thing in use. And then Visual Studio Code came out, and it was this brand new thing. And I told 2 friends, and they told 2 friends, and suddenly Visual Studio Code is one of the most popular editor/IDEs there is. And so we see the same balance internally, and we work at Google to support with Flutter development, to support the tools that people use internally. And those tools are a mix of Android Studio, IntelliJ, Visual Studio Code. It's behind the community as a whole, right? It hasn't made it up to that same percentage split, but it's definitely on a trend, right, where it's growing use internally. But then there's all kinds of other, we use a monorepo with our own proprietary source code control system, and we have a lot of CI/CD systems that are based around that, testing that is all based around that monorepo strategy. And so we have to support internal Googlers who are writing Flutter in that tool chain. But increasingly, that means Visual Studio Code. Absolutely.
Are there, just building from that, are there any extensions to add to VS Code that are considered in the tech stack from Google's perspective?
Oh, that's a good question. Obviously, I'm a fan of the Flutter and Dart extensions.
Oh yeah, well, clearly, yes.
I have gone back and forth on a few others. I guess my other one that I would definitely recommend, although I would have some features that I would request for it myself, is the PubSpec Assistant tool.
Yes.
Where you can just say, oh, I want to add a dependency, I want to add a dev dependency, type some stuff, and it looks it up and throws it in and sorts them all and picks the latest and greatest version number. And yeah, it's all pretty cool. So that I use, and I think if you haven't tried it out, you should. It's pretty useful. Lots of people like the bracket colorizer.
Yeah.
There's when you're writing your build method, you got a lot of semicolon or parens and braces and brackets, and it's good for helping you balance those. Yeah, but the obviously the only one that is absolutely required is the Flutter one.
Yeah.
Do you guys have any internal VS Code plugins?
I assume we do, but none leaps to my mind in terms of, oh my God, we have this thing that will toast your bread for you and bring it to you on a plate while you're coding, or whatever, right? Nothing I can think of off the top of my head. That's awesome.
Yeah, there's a few options for snippets, and I think there's two versions of bracket pair colorizer. Two being the more recent one, and by more recent I mean I've been using it for over 2 years, so I don't know exactly when it came out, but yeah. What's after null safety? What's the next big thing, or can you tell us that?
Yeah, so I mean, we've been looking at Bob Nystrom, the chief architect for the Dart programming language. He mentioned some in the Flutter 2 keynote that I think are pretty great. He talked about the ability to do type aliases, and we're looking at data classes, things like those. But the big one he talked about was this idea of metaprogramming. And metaprogramming is especially interesting because one of the things we did is we squeezed reflection out of the language. And the reason and for those who are unfamiliar, a reflection is the runtime ability to use type information as a way to drive program behavior. So, it's a really good way to, at runtime map, hey, I've got some results from a SQL query, let me map it to a type. Or it's really great for bridging type systems for XML or JSON. Of course, you can use it for all kinds of things, but lots of people use it for that kind of thing. But without reflection, it becomes now much harder to do that because you don't have that type of information at runtime. Now, the reason we did that was because we wanted our Dart and Flutter programs to be the smallest, fastest they could possibly be. And of course, we wanted our runtime to be as small as we could make it. And we wanted our code to be as small as we could make it so that we can run on, a wider range of devices. So the question is now, well, how do we get that functionality? Because you still want to do that, right? You've got some, data structured from another type system. You want to map it to Dart types or other kinds of things without writing all the boilerplate code, which, is not only a productivity killer, but that's where bugs come from, right? You don't want to introduce a bug farm into your system by having to write all that code by hand. So metaprogramming is the way I think about it is think of it as compile time code gen, right? Where you can actually, and Lisp has something called macros, REST has macros. It's a similar concept. It's not something that we've invented, but it's meant to fill that hole where you can tell the compiler, hey, I see these attributes. I want to generate this code and make that part of the compile time step. We give full control to the developer because they can, they write their own compiler generators or pull down some code that has it in there that they can then use. But they don't have to write all the boilerplate, the error-prone boilerplate. So, and they don't have the runtime penalty, right? So we think of it as a win-win there, but it's hard to do. Other systems have had to do this. Other systems had. I've just mentioned a couple, and there's many more. And so we want to do this in a way that makes sense for the Dart developer. And so we're working on that, and I'm very excited about it. I'm fundamentally lazy, so I don't like to write that kind of code. So I'm looking forward to writing my meta programs.
Yeah, and just the term itself, I love, because I have some bias here, but meta being Greek for above or beyond, but really it's probably closer to say by breaking the fourth wall. And my specialty of medicine is a meta specialty, because you can do it from all specialties of medicine. We have a meta blog, and metacognition is the mental models that you actually had mentioned, Luke, earlier. So meta programming from the QC Flutter event 2 weeks ago, it's the first time I've ever heard that term, and it just made me smile, because now there is another thing that is allowing it to be a little bit easier from the perspective of the end user. I think that's excellent.
Totally.
Chris, if I may, sorry, go ahead.
I was just gonna say, I mean, that is the whole point of Dart and Flutter, right? We picked Dart because it was optimized for front-end development across a number of axes. And the Dart team continues to do an amazing job of bringing new features that are gonna really make an impact to the Flutter developers' lives. Null safety just being the most recent example.
So I was wondering, Chris, with the type of metaprogramming you're talking about, are you guys anticipating it to look like annotations like we have in code generation now, or is it like people can create their own new syntax?
My guess is it will be based around annotations, but I honestly don't know. And in fact, I don't think we've made any real hard decisions there ourselves yet. I think we're exploring options and avenues. The reason I think it'll be based on annotations is we have that as part of the language already.
Mhm.
It's a concept people understand, and we're already using it for, like build, right? There's a build runner, and that can, read annotations and make that available to you. So it's a smaller step. That said, who knows what Bob's cooking up? I honestly don't.
So I've heard some concerns. This might be a little bit of a hardball question, so bear with me.
Go ahead.
I've heard some concerns about people saying that they're a little worried about metaprogramming coming to Dart because Dart has always been such an opinionated language, and they're worried about people like community members coming up with whole new paradigms that could really confuse the ecosystem, as opposed to asking the Dart team to do like an opinionated data classes is probably the first thing I would think of. Do you have any opinions on that concern?
Here, I will give you a meta opinion on that opinion, which is, in general, the Dart team is very familiar with that feedback, very sensitive to that problem, right? Believe me that we fight hard always to make sure that the functionality we bring keeps the complexity to the absolute minimum, and you shouldn't have to feel that complexity unless you adopt that feature. So even if of course there will be some additional complexity. It's metaprogramming, right? You're writing programs that write programs. That is fundamentally just hard to think about, right? And even for experienced programmers, hard to get right. That said, hopefully, as in all of these things, the bulk of the complexity will be in developing the metaprograms, and adopting them for use should be easy. And I expect most of the use of metaprogramming to be applying attributes as opposed to writing the implementations of the attributes. So and again, I don't know if it's going to be attribute based or not, but the idea is that the metaprogram author will have to experience some complexity, of course, which we'll attempt to minimize, but the user, it should feel like using any other part of the language. And I also agree that you're right, that if we start making it possible to just change the language completely, then that has all kinds of negative side effects that we definitely want to avoid.
So I had a follow up to that, if you don't mind. Has there been any discussion about metaprogramming? Has there been any discussion about investing into metaprogramming so that the Dart team can then implement something like data classes?
I'm sure that has been part of the discussions, and my guess is the reason we haven't yet done data classes is because we want to get a little further down the metaprogramming path to see if that is something we could implement with metaprogramming before we start adding, new features as a language. But now I'm just making some stuff up. Your guess is as good as mine as far as that goes.
So with the analogy of widgets being a declarative UI, and I give it where you're driving a car, you don't have to know what the pistons or spark plugs look like. You just put the key in the ignition and, put the pedal, step on the gas, right? Would this be, in essence, an attempt of doing some element of declarative metaprogramming to try and make this easier for you to work with something that is inherently complex?
Yeah, while I have a guess as to how I might apply, metaprograms to my Dart code, I honestly do not know what they have in mind for how to write them. So it could be declarative, it could be imperative, it could be AST based, and somebody hands you an AST and you screw with it and send it back. All runs at compile time. There's all kinds of ways to implement this. I've seen it done a bunch of ways. I do not know what we plan to do with Dart. And even if I did, what we're doing right now in our experiments may or may not have any bearing on what we actually ship to users. So at this point, I would just be making stuff up.
No worries. I also want to point out, and I love that we have gone in a clockwise circle with our images and icons. I've enjoyed this over the time. It has made me smile. Okay. I have one other question, and then I want to leave it open to others as well. That was listed, but I don't think we've covered yet about Flutter WebGL and the current state or plan for that. Do you mind touching on that a little bit, or have?
I'm sorry, I missed your question.
The current state of Flutter WebGL.
So we base our implementation of Flutter Web on CanvasKit, the fastest renderer. That, of course, is essentially an implementation of Skia, which is our universal API at the bottom level for Flutter, which is itself based on Canvas. I don't know actually to what extent that depends on WebGL. And I haven't heard the team talk about using WebGL for that in the future.
Okay, thank you. Mm-hmm. Do others on the line have other questions that they want to ask?
Yeah, I had another one actually. Going back to metaprogramming, I was wondering if the Flutter/Dart teams have talked about using it as a way to explore potential language features, sort of similar to Babel and TC39, and that process of how they introduce new features to JavaScript.
That's an excellent question. I have not heard that discussed, but that doesn't mean anything. The Dart language tends to be pretty heads down when they're doing their experimenting with these kinds of things, and they don't tend to get the pesky PMs involved until we push our way in. So I honestly do not know.
It would be an interesting way for the community to propose features.
Agreed. Mm-hmm. Again, depending on how it worked, right? If it was purely attribute based, then there would be no way to build these kinds of language, or rather, the kinds of language features you could build would be narrower. On the other hand, if you could just add any keyword you felt like, hey, you'd go crazy. Although, we'll see where we end up. I'm guessing it won't be there.
I did have a question for you. I think it was Bob was working on a records API, and it was records and tuples, I believe he was calling it. And I think it was Bob. I think he goes by Munificent on GitHub. Right.
That's right.
And anyway, so I heard that he was working on that. I don't know how far he got with that, but my understanding was that records was going to be a precursor to data classes. Do you happen to know if there's any connection there, or
Yeah,
how
that's
far he's gone through that?
Yeah, I mean, so whenever we want to build a new feature, well, a lot of times in Dart we're inspired by other languages, and of course all the languages are inspired by each other um, in terms of good features and good ideas, and we want the good ideas from other languages in Dart, just like we've seen some Dart ideas make their way into other languages, and that's great, right? It's a big old world. I do know that when we think about like I'll give you the example you used, data classes from Colin. That is a great feature that fits well into Colin. It would be a mistake for us to pick it up whole cloth and drop it into Dart. That wouldn't work. It wouldn't fit in to the language. That said, there's a lot of great ideas in there that would work well in the Dart language. And so it's our job to kind of look at when people say, hey, they want data classes, they want extensions, they want null safety, they want, meta programming, macros, whatever it is they say they want. It's our job to look at that and understand and pull that apart and say, what's the value in that feature? What are the components of it? What are the key bits? What are the syntactic sugar that makes it work well in whatever languages we're looking at? And then think about, okay, how do we get the benefit of that in a way that when we add it to Dart, it feels like Dart? We don't want to start bolting on things that don't feel like Dart. That's why things like extension methods feel very natural as a part of Dart, even though they're pretty new. Why null safety feels very natural as a part of Dart, even though it's completely brand new. When we look at things, the records work was Bob's way of kind of exploring that space and thinking, what are the real benefits we would want? When people say we want data classes, what does that really mean? What are the features and benefits that we're looking to add? And so that's what we do. And so Bob is looking at records and tuples and such like as a way to experiment with those features and what they would be like when it comes to adding data classes or something like it to Dart.
Awesome. Well, Chris, thank you so much for your time. Sure. Certainly, we all greatly appreciate this. I think with this in mind, I will probably end the stream, but I will keep this air meet open in case people actually want to see and see what some of the lounge is. I don't know if anybody's had a chance to use that, but you can actually go into different tables. So I will stick around somewhat informally over the next 5 or so minutes, or 5 to 10 minutes. But really, the questions asked here were greatly appreciated, and we all greatly value the time that you've spent to connect with us. So
absolutely happy to. I love developers are my people. I was very happy to be here.
Well, thank you.